Good morning, everybody. I hope you all enjoyed my episode yesterday featuring my good friend Ken McAuliffe talking about great songs for a Sunday morning. Great stuff. Thanks very much, Ken. It's very appreciated. Today we're going to dive into a two-part series on the great trombone players of jazz. Tricky Sam Nan. We'll get back to that in a second. But trombone was a very important instrument coming out of the marching bands into the New Orleans sound. It's featured heavily in New Orleans Dixieland jazz music, and it migrates into the swing bands, and most of the great, if not all the great swing bands, had large bone sections, and a lot of the great players in this era are from those groups. The first guy we're going to discuss here, one of the interesting things about the trombone is it kind of falls out of favor after 1960. And you have a few established guys, J.J. Johnson and Curtis Fuller, Benny Green, who are still doing great records. And there's a few guys who come along. But once you get into the saxophone era of the mid-60s and then the free and the avant-garde, the trombone becomes a much less frequented instrument. A lot few guys are playing it. And even the trumpet starts becoming less used in jazz by the mid-60s. If you look at a lot of the great jazz labels from the 50s and 60s, most of their great trumpet players and records are from the late 50s and the early 60s. And of course you got guys like Lee Morgan who are going to perpetuate through the decade. But the ranks aren't producing new trumpet players left and right like they are with saxophone. And even labels like Verve and Impulse, the amount of trombone records they have and trumpet records they have, it's pretty minimal. You know, you get Fuller and Hubbard on Impulse and a few things, but when you look for great trumpet players on Verve, especially in the Creed Taylor era, it was surprising how skimmy that was. And you do have Kai Winding doing trombone stuff on Verve, but these instruments both kind of take a back seat in the 60s. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in and take a little tour. It's going to be somewhat chronological. Kid Ory is the first guy we're going to talk about. He played, of course, with Armstrong. He plays with Jelly Roll Morton, plays with King Oliver, Bessie Smith. He actually mentored Benny Goodman, and later on he mentored a young Charlie Mingus. He moves to Chicago and plays with all the greats. And he's a giant of the Dixieland full swinging ensemble New Orleans sound. And like I said, he played with all the guys of that era pretty extensively. The trombone's a very interesting instrument for numerous reasons. It is capable of having a really wide range in sound. And it can be a very smooth, fluid thing. It can be kind of a blurting, rhythmic instrument. And as J.J. Johnson showed us, and Curtis Fuller as well, it could be a lead instrument in the bop sensibility. But Jack Teagarden was another guy who comes along, a real strong proponent of the New Orleans Dixieland sound. And again, you got a guy that's played with Armstrong for years. I have a number of Teagarden recordings here. I'm going to show you a couple. This is something on MCA that's a collection of much earlier 78s with different working groups. He has a couple records he does here on Verve, 8495 and 8416. Misery and the Blues. And this is Jack Teagarden with Bobby Hackett, Hank Jones, Ed Shaughnessy, George Duvivier, a lot of other cats of that same ilk. Teagarden's a great player. He's a very expressive player. He seems to always be having a lot of fun. He played early on with Paul Whiteman, Of course, he played with Louis Armstrong's All-Stars for a long time, one of the first great integrated groups. He's born in 1905. He was self-taught Teagarden, which led him to play some of his phrasing and shaping different than other people, which gave him some very unique characteristics as a trombone player. This is a recording he does for Bethlehem in the early to mid-50s, probably 55, and he's blowing pretty hard there, you know. The next guy we want to talk about real quick is Tommy Dorsey. Dorsey led one of the great swing groups of the Depression era into the 40s. Of course, he's the proving grounds for a young Francis Albert Sinatra. The trombone's ability to sing, to even have a vibrato. People often talk about the tenor saxophone mimicking a male voice. There's really no instrument that can warble and warmly hum a melody quite like the trombone can. This is a cool 10-inch on Riverside, probably from a 52, 53, probably very early in, it's 1051, so it can't be that early unless they bought it. Looks like it's more vintage material that probably Bill Grauer purchased and issued. But it's Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey with the California Ramblers. Great stuff. Old Tommy Dorsey, 12 inches, 10 inches shouldn't be that hard to come by. Next we're going to jump into Ellington. And Ellington, of course, houses a lot of the great trumpet players of all time. And we touched on this song a little bit earlier, but this here is the fantastic Joe Tricky Sam Nanton. He was famous for using a plunger and getting this wah-wah effect. He plays with Ellington from 28 into the 40s, where he passes from a stroke. Just a guy with a ton of personality, and he was very different than the other guys in Ellington's group. Juan Tisdale, of course, was there for a long time. Tisdale was a composer, composed some of the great songs like Caravan. They had a rich, warm tone. So when you couple that with wah-wah and the effects and fun of Tricky Sam Nanton, it gave Ellington a broad arsenal to use. And of course, Lawrence Brown was also a trombone player in the Ellington group. Great vibrato, great creamy tone. He's a great on the ballads with Lawrence Brown, and he's in the group from 32 to 51 before he goes and joins Johnny Hodges. So the Ellington group obviously utilizes the trombone a lot. The trombone section was often 2, 3, 4 guys, and there's guys still joining the group in the later years that were cutting their teeth, as it were, on the Ellington stage. And as great as the Art Blakey tree is in terms of jazz royalty and players, the Ellington tree is even that much greater. That was Ellington, of course, in the late 20s. But there's a lot of great swing era stuff. Herbie Green is another great player. He has this record here on ABC. He gets a couple sessions. Sorry, this is on Bethlehem. He has a couple sessions here on ABC. He gets this early session at Blue Note on the 10-inch from the early 50s. If I recall, Herbie Green also played with Woody Herman and Count Basie. So these guys all have kind of a swing pedigree to them, which is keeping them kind of bunched together here. The trombone, there it is. The bone. The other great group, of course, that I want to discuss for a minute is Count Basie's groups. And a lot of these groups, the membership kind of comes and goes over the years. But you had a guy named Benny Powell who played with Lionel Hampton and then with Count Basie. The saxophone on April in Paris, that wonderful soft solo, that's Benny Powell playing the saxophone. He goes on to play with Fat Jones and Mel Lewis later on. Henry Coker was another guy who plays with Basie in the 50s and the 60s. Herbie Green, as I mentioned, played with Basie for a while. And then, of course, the great Al Gray. And Al Gray was a plunger master, tons of personality throughout the Verve years and the Roulette years. You got a guy like Al Gray plunging away with that great orchestra for Basie. And Glenn Miller was also a guy from the swing era who led a great orchestra on the softer side of things, who was a trombone player. Al Gray, of course, plays with Basie all the way into the Pablo years. He's still showing up. Got the wrong record in that one. As well as Al Gray playing with those great Basie bands over the years, Al Gray makes a number of records as a solo guy, starting off with this Dizzy Atmosphere. And this is a reference to the Dizzy Gillespie big band, who Al Gray, Billy Mitchell, a lot of these guys played in that group. And that's a great record on the Specialty label. It's tough to come by. Like I said, I talked about this record the other day, and I ended up putting the wrong record back in there. Al Gray then moves on to the Argo label, and his records are always going to have a swing to them. This is Al Gray, the Thinking Man's Trombone on Argo 677. 653, Al Gray and the Basie Wing, the last of the big plungers. 689, Al Gray with the Billy Mitchell Sextet. Fantastic stuff. Al Gray, Snap Your Fingers with Billy Mitchell once again. Al Gray, Night Song with Billy Mitchell. Al Gray, Boss Bone 731. And this is Having a Ball 718. All 7 of those Argo records, the ones with Billy Mitchell and the ones where it's just him, are swing-based modern jazz and smaller groups playing a fun, very loose, very joyful style of jazz. If there's one thing you can say about an Al Gray record, it's always going to be fun. You know, he just has that personality. Al Gray was born June 6, 1925. Most of the guys here we find are born in the 20s and 30s. He's from Virginia. He was in the Navy briefly. He plays with Benny Carter, Jimmy Lunsford, Lucky Millinder, Lionel Hampton, the Dizzy Gillespie Big Band, and Basie. So it's just a who's who of big bands. A guy like Al Gray was in and out of the ranks of those groups for years. And I've come to really dig Al Gray's records. They're a lot of fun and have some great players on them. The next guy I want to dive into here is a guy by the name of Benny Green. And I'm a big Benny Green guy. He makes this session here with on the Decca label. And it's one of those split things where one 10 inches on one side, the other 10 inches Paul Kennedy's on the other side. It's a pretty tough record to come by, but it's one that I've liked a lot. And I'm showing Benny Green now because Benny Green is kind of in the mold of an Al Gray. He plays soulful. He swings hard. He of course dabbles in the hard bop sound, being the times that he was a part of. This is with Art Farmer here. And this is a pretty up-tempo track for Benny Green, but he plays in a melodic sense, the center of the tone. He's always going to be, like I said, sweet and melodic and swinging. He wasn't as interested in following the Charlie Parker bebop movement, and of course J.J. Johnson, who we'll talk about shortly, who was the great innovator on the trombone and makes it the instrument that it becomes. But I love Benny Green. He's kind of the softer side of the trombone in a lot of ways. We're gonna just flip through his discography here. This one's on Jazzland with Johnny Griffin and Junior Mance. This is on Bethlehem, The Hornful of Soul, Benny Green, probably 1958, 59. This is with Kai and JJ, Benny Green, so it's 3 trombone players. This is actually from an earlier recording. It comes out 70-30, but I think it's actually probably recorded in 52 or 53. Here's a great Benny Green session on the VJ label. It's also got Nat Adderley and Gene Ammons, Tommy Flanagan, Frank Foster. So you got some guys from Basie's group in there. This is a cool record. Benny Green blows his horn, but it's actually a repressing of an earlier Benny Green session on Prestige. This one. So that's just the same record reissued. He also does this one on Prestige 70-49, Walking Down, great album cover. And that leaves us 3 Blue Notes, who I love these records. 4010, Benny Green, Walking and Talking, Benny Green, Soul Stirring 1599, and Benny Green Back on the Scene 1587. What a great album cover that is. And I love some of the sessions and the sidemen on some of these records. Charlie Rouse, George Tucker, Joe Knight, Louis Hayes are the sidemen on that one. The sidemen on this one, Soul Stirring. Billy Root, Sonny Clark, Ike Isaacs, and Elvin Jones. So again, Benny's a bit like Durham and some of the other guys who aren't quite as keen on being just part of the Blue Note sound. They're going to kind of go their own direction a little bit and do their own thing. A couple of stragglers here. This is a Benny Green record on the Time label. It's a nice little record. Great group on here. I think George Tucker and Sonny Clark and Jimmy Forrest. So that's a great little sextet. And then this is on, I think it was on the Warwick label originally. This is on Mount Vernon Music here. This is Benny Green Swings the Blues. And I believe this is from like 61 or 62 in there somewhere. So Benny's a great player. And again, he's kind of a throwback to an earlier era of playing soft, tonally, and just being conscious of being beautiful, you know? And I think some of the guys who play with more soul and more feel and don't necessarily blow as hard as the bebop guys and the hard bop guys often will get less credence, less love, less people clamoring to collect their records. And I think it's a little strange, you know? Not everything has to be banging you over the head all the time. But now we're going to move on to J.J. Johnson. And J.J. is the guy who kind of single-handedly changes the direction of the trombone. There's guys that innovate on instruments and change the game. And, of course, Parker kind of brings the innovation across the music, and guys follow him on various instruments. But this is with Clifford Brown, Jimmy Heath, John Lewis, Percy Heath, and Kenny Clark. Blue Note, 5028. So that's from probably 1953 or so. J.J. Johnson's career is very important to the history of jazz. You know, he was just a wonderful player that definitely changes the direction of the music. We're going to dive into some of his work here. This is an early session on Prestige from a few different settings, and it looks like they're not even playing together. It's just 3 different 10 inches compiled, or maybe even 78s. This is on Savoy here, and this is from his time in the Army. He was stationed in Korea and Japan for a while, along with Howard McGee and Oscar Pettiford. And so they record these at USO stations, and the Savoy Regent label puts this out. It's not the best sounding recording, but it's still worthwhile having. And then 12,010, so the 10th release on the Savoy label is this wonderful album here of Jay and Kai. And again, it's J.J. Johnson who takes the trombone and breathes bebop into it. And it's not an instrument that lends itself very kindly to fast rhythmic playing. You know, it requires a fairly strong lung capacity. You're sliding up and down, so that you got to find that clean tone. And when you're playing in an ensemble, or when you're playing kind of slower tempos, the trombone's very efficient. But when you have to play really fast, it requires a dexterity, and a lot of people thought it couldn't be done, almost. And it was actually Fats Navarro who told J.J. Johnson to play more like Lester Young. And then Dizzy Gillespie heard young J.J. Johnson and said somebody had to come along and play bebop on it. And I'm appointing you. It might as well be you. And it's Ozzy Cadena was the guy who produced the Savoy record here we're talking about with Jay and Kai. And Kai Winding was a Danish immigrant to America who was also a fiery young trombone player. And these two made a lot of records together. And what's crazy is they really only recorded together from 54 to 56. The session on Savoy, then they do the session on Bethlehem, which I'll show you. And then they do a string on there's the Bethlehem one. That's a later pressing where they retitle it Enough Said. The original one doesn't have that on there. Shortly after that, they go to Columbia together. And these are the Blue Note sessions from 52, 53, 54 even. And again, JJ, early Blue Note 1500 series. The recordings are from earlier than that. But Jay and Kai together make some fantastic records on Columbia. They're some of the great records of the early to mid 50s on Columbia. Some of the jazziest stuff and the most modern jazz Columbia is doing in 54, 55, 56 is absolutely with these J.J. Johnson records. And this record, First Place, was a fantastic session. The band on here is Max Roach, Paul Chambers, and Tommy Flanagan. And we're going to dig into this one a little bit. It's a pretty all-star group, though. When you're talking Max Roach, Paul Chambers, Tommy Flanagan with J.J. Johnson. And you can hear J.J. He just flies. Still very clean. He's enunciating all the tones. He's got the Clifford melodic rhythm and roller coaster that's always smooth. And he really was a game changer and won all the awards for a long time, thus the name First Place. J.J. Johnson changes the trombone. And very few guys really could even emulate him. Curtis Fuller is probably the closest, and Fuller, of course, certainly tries his best to do so. J.J. Johnson in person, a live one. Blue Trombone, again with Max Roach, Paul Chambers, and Tommy Flanagan. Those are two of the best Columbia records from 55. It's just great stuff. And Ellington's making some good stuff here in Columbia, and they're about to sign Miles and about to do the Jazz Messenger stuff. But at this point, this is some of the best stuff that Columbia is doing. This is really living the J.J. Johnson Sextet. This has Nat Adderley, Bobby Jasper, Cedar Walton, James Spanky DeBress, and Albert Heath. So there's some really serious players on these Columbia records. J.J. Johnson Sextet. This is from 1606. So this probably comes out 1960. It's recorded. So it looks like he stays with Columbia quite a long time. A touch of satin, playing kind of some softer ballady stuff. J.J. Johnson's Broadway. He's playing some big arrangements. Irby Green, Lou McGarity, Tommy Mitchell, Paul Felice. There's 5 trombone players on this. 1963 in New York City, that was recorded. So JJ makes just a wide string of recordings. And then him and JJ and Kai record together as a duo from 54 to 56. They reunite in 1960 to be the first Impulse record. Impulse A1 is J and Kai with Bill Evans, Paul Chambers, Tommy Williams, Roy Haynes, and Art Taylor. So that tells you something about the place J.J. Johnson is in jazz. When Impulse launches this new label, Coltrane is in the first release. He's not even one of the first 4. They put 4 out simultaneously. J.J. Johnson and Kai Winding is the first Impulse record. This is proof positive. J.J. Johnson, this is recorded probably 1963 on Impulse. And then Creed Taylor gets them to reunite when he goes to A&M in 1968. And these two make K and J.J. Israel and Betwixt and Between together. So even though the first union's only 3 years on Columbia, they do reunite several times, and they also do some live stuff together over the years. It was a great working group. And we're going to dig into Winding stuff here on part 2 of this. But J.J. Johnson is, like I said, probably the pinnacle of the trombone. And you're going to see it go into a fairly steep decline not long after this. I think in a way, J.J. Johnson pushed all the boundaries of the instrument. And it was really tough to imitate and play like him. He was just so dexterous and so nimble and yet melodic and easy to listen to. And he kind of stands heads and shoulders above most of his contemporaries on the trombone. Stay tuned. We're going to do part 2 next, and we'll publish that tomorrow. I appreciate you all. Hope y'all are safe out there. Dig your trombone players. And y'all be safe. Peace.